Now, it's my pleasure to introduce a colleague and friend, Nancy Carnevale, the author of A New Language, A New World, Italian Immigrants in the United States, 1890 to 1945, published by the University of Illinois Press, which won the 2010 American Book Award. Dr. Carnevale did her research here at Rutgers University, where she completed her PhD. She now is associate professor at Montclair University, where she teaches courses in Italian American history and women's studies. She's co-editor of a series at Fordham University Press called Critical Studies in Italian America, and she's the book review editor of the Italian American Review. Her work has been supported by grants from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Her current research interest is African-American, Italian-American relations in urban and suburban 20th century New Jersey. Dr. Carnevale.
Buongiorno. Very happy to be here and to see such a full audience. I want to begin by, well, first thanking Bill for my introduction. And I'd like to thank Gilda for inviting me to speak today, and moreover for inviting me to contribute to the universality of Italian heritage curriculum that she has pioneered to introduce into New Jersey secondary schools. And specifically on the area that I've done my research in, which is this whole question of the experience of language for Italian immigrants in the United States. And so what I was asked to do was to present a little bit of my lesson plan that I'm developing. But really I'm just going to limit myself to giving you a bit of a sketch of the linguistic history of Italian immigrants beginning in Italy at the turn of the 20th century and taking us up through World War II. And I will be brief, I don't have a whole lot of time. At the time that Italy became unified in 1861, only between about 2.5 and 12% of the entire country spoke Italian. The rest spoke regional and local dialects that from a linguistic point of view, if you ask a linguist, they are distinct languages. They are not sort of derivations of standard Italian and as such sort of less than Italian. They're actually their own languages, all derived from Latin. What they didn't have that standard Italian had was the legitimacy imparted by the state. Standard Italian itself, as I'm sure most of you know, was the Florentine dialect, but it became elevated to a language in a way that the other dialects were not. Quick on the heels of unification of Italy, the South quickly became associated with economic underdevelopment along with cultural and social backwardness. These views resulted from Northern Italian prejudice based on a perception of racial difference in Southerners, as well as policies of the new Italian government that really privileged the North. And as a result, the Southern Italian dialects, as the languages of a devalued South, became particularly stigmatized. So Italian immigrants, bring this history with them. As they bring their luggage with them, they bring this internalized history of language. And they arrive here unable to speak standard Italian, and of course unable largely to speak English. Speaking instead the dialects that their own very local dialects that could be, depending on where they came from, virtually unintelligible, even to other Italians. The high rate of illiteracy that went hand in hand with the extreme poverty of the South ensured that Italian immigrants would face particular difficulties in acquiring English. As unskilled laborers with little education, as we heard from Bill, they found themselves as a group at the lowest end of the economic spectrum for many years. Initially, many of the largely single male migrants, as also Bill said, intended to return. They had really no intention of staying here. And that, of course, impeded further their ability to acquire English. That is, they had no interest in learning English. They didn't anticipate that they would stay here. Women who were more isolated because they tended to work at home learned English at even lower rates. And I should add that sometimes Italian men saw the acquisition of English as a step towards American-style emancipation, and so sometimes resisted also the efforts of women to learn English. All of this background ensured that Italians would continue to lag behind other European immigrant groups well into the 20th century, which is kind of curious because I think I often hear from Italian Americans that, unlike immigrants today, that their families acquired English very quickly and very sort of without resistance. But as a group, and that I don't dispute that in individual cases, but as a group, even into the 1930s and 40s, Italians were last among Southern and Eastern European groups to acquire English. So how did they cope? They compensated as immigrants had done before them and as they continue to do, that is, by creating mixed languages, Italo-American dialects, if you will, that varied by place of origin within Italy and within settlement in the United States. These dialects combined Italian dialects, Italianized English or Anglicized Italian, depending on the linguist you speak to, along with some elements of Standard Italian. And they might even include words from other immigrant groups that they came into contact with. This linguistic situation that Italian Americans faced was aggravated by the very particular meanings that English and immigrant languages had acquired in the United States in these early years of the 20th century. Many of you might be surprised to know that the United States actually had a history of great linguistic tolerance extending all the way through the 19th century. But with the advent of mass migration from Southern and Eastern Europe at the turn of the 20th century, along with that migration came a new era of linguistic chauvinism. And there was really an abrupt and rather complete end to that linguistic tolerance. This linguistic intolerance became a major feature of popular anti-immigrant sentiment. And that made it difficult for immigrants to maintain their languages, and of course with the language comes the culture. In particular, acquiring English and doing away with the immigrant language became the hallmark of an American. And even today, it always strikes me when I ask my students, what does it mean to be American? What do we think of when we say American? Not too many people talk about the Constitution, democracy. They say English. English is what makes us American. It's not like that in other countries. Language doesn't have always the particular resonance that it has acquired in this country, and that attitude originates in the nativism of the early 20th century. So that English language instruction really became the focus of Americanization efforts. In schools, non-English speaking Italian and other immigrant children never heard their languages or cultures mentioned. As the famed Italian-American educator Leonard Covello noted about growing up in this era and going to school in New York, quote, "We were becoming Americans by learning how to be ashamed of our parents." Going up a little bit then to World War II, when the United States was at war for a time with Italy, Italian nationals in the United States were declared enemy aliens and subject to various restrictions. In some parts of the country, this included temporary forced relocation. Less well known is that it included spot checks, so-called spot checks by FBI agents on Italian households. They were going into Italian households specifically looking for evidence of disloyalty during this very tense time in relations with Italy. And that evidence of disloyalty could include knowledge of the Italian language, possession of letters or newspapers in Italian, the ability to speak Italian, could put somebody, in suspicion of being anti-American. And so, although a disproportionate number of Italian Americans enlisted in the war effort, and people have speculated that the reason the enlistment was so high for Italian Americans was precisely because the second generation was looking for greater acceptance and hoped to find it by serving their country. Italian American patriotism, nevertheless, was questioned for a time. And as a result of this wartime atmosphere, significant numbers of Italian Americans stopped speaking Italian in its many variants. Every time I present on this subject, I hear stories from people about how, oh yeah, that's when, my parents said, we're not going to speak Italian here anymore, So that's not the whole of the story. My research has included sort of the personal experiences, the subjective experiences of immigrants and what English meant to them, what their dialects meant to them. But I wanted to give you just some sense of the overall picture in the United States. I'm really pleased that this really critical aspect of Italian American life that really has not received much attention is going to be finding its way into the classrooms. And I thank you for the opportunity to let me present this here to you today. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Whatever you think. Whatever you think.
Are there any questions concerning Professor Carnevale's presentation or questions of language? Let me say that the role of the Italian language is absolutely crucial in understanding the role of Italians in this country in the 20th century. I can say personally how important it was for me as a little Irish kid in Yonkers playing with Italian kids in the streets, how at 3 o'clock in the afternoon their nonne, their grandmothers, would come out. Now, they couldn't speak, my friends couldn't speak Italian, just a few words with their grandmothers, because their parents didn't want them to speak Italian. But the nonne would give the little Irish kid, l'irlandesino, 2 biscotti if I said a word in Italian. So soon I was speaking wonderfully with the grandmothers of my friends, and my parents didn't mind. So. Yes.
Hi. Yes.
And basically, this issue of alien enemy was really more about fascism than language. That's what everything came through. And the number of people deported or under control from government were basically below 1,000 a day. I would say that there was really that the research conclusion was that basically there was a loyalty of Italians to the United States despite the language that was basically conveyed publicly through the figure of the support. So I would say building research in this area, in other words, the question is basically there was no doubt, no question about the loyalty to the Italians to the United States during World War II. Than basically which was based on embracing the American values. Language was a minor factor in this, view.
Well, I would say that in terms of certainly in terms of the number, I think the figure you just gave was in terms of the number of people actually interned. And that was very low, and that was mostly Italian nationals, yes, not, Italians actually coming over. When I say enemy aliens, I'm talking about over 600,000 people who were declared enemy aliens. They had to carry papers with them. They were prohibited from keeping firearms, radios, all of these things that I mentioned having to do with the language in their house. In California, thousands of people were relocated because it was thought they lived too close to the sea. No less than Joe DiMaggio's father lost his fishing boat at the height of, Joe DiMaggio's fame. Yes, it doesn't last that long, this period where Italians are questioned, but Italians really didn't know that it wasn't going to last that long. It's about a year that they're declared enemy aliens. What can I say? I think if you were living in this country and you heard that from your neighbors that the FBI was coming into your house, that the FBI could be coming to your house and looking for things, if you were seeing posters showing pictures of, the Emperor of Japan and Mussolini and Hitler that said, "Don't speak the enemy's language," this was like a very popular poster that was all around. In ways subtle and very overt, the entire, the culture was, that's how people are identified, is in large part through how they speak. That we know that Italians were aware of this. It was not uncommon in Italian neighborhoods to find signs saying, "No Italian spoken for the duration of the war," signs posted in stores. In cities where the population was more dense, places like New York and Boston, maybe they didn't feel it quite as much because they were all together. A lot of these spot checks actually took place in more remote areas, which in itself is kind of indicative of how widespread. They were going to Alaska to find Italians. Who knew there were any Italians in Alaska in the 1940s? So I can only tell you what I found in my research.